You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda, and I'm delighted to be joined today by somebody that I've really wanted to get on the show for a while now, but have been remiss in doing so for whatever reason. Joining me today is M. Taylor Fravel, a professor of political science and the director of the Security Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Taylor, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing pretty well. I think we've all been better, given that we're several months into a pandemic, and for those of us in the United States, obviously it's been quite a week when it comes to everything going on. But of course, we're not here to talk about those developments or even the pandemic today. So for listeners who might not be aware, Taylor is one of the foremost scholars of China's periphery and including its border disputes with many of its neighbors. He's the author of, among other things, Strong Border, Secure Nation, Cooperation and Conflict in China's Territorial Disputes, an authoritative study of the subject. And more recently, his latest book, Active Defense, China's Military Strategy Since 1949, is also a great look at the evolution of the People's Liberation Army's thinking about national defense as an enterprise. And I actually conducted an interview with Taylor for The Diplomat not long ago about that book, and I recommend listeners take a look at that if they're interested in learning more about that. But Taylor, I'm especially glad that you're here because I've had a lot of demand from podcast listeners to talk about the ongoing kerfuffle, so to speak, or dust up, whatever you want to call it, at the India-China border. This is something that both of us were following quite closely back in 2017 when we had a major 72-day standoff on a piece of Bhutanese territory, relatively obscure until that standoff, known as Doklam. And I did a lot of writing and coverage on that, but I haven't actually been doing a lot of writing on the current round of India-China border issues. And one of the reasons is it's actually very unclear what's happening where. There have been a lot of conflicting reports, primarily from Indian sources, given that we do have generally more reporting on the Indian side. But I'm hoping that, we'll together be able to shed a little bit of light on the situation at the border. But you wrote a great piece for the Washington Post's Monkey Cage channel on the general dispute. And I think the place to start might be a little bit of situational awareness, because we're going to be hitting our listeners with terms like the line of actual control, Pangong Lake, Galwan River, Sikkim, the 2003 the 1993 Agreement on Peace and Tranquility between India and China. And I just thought it'd be a useful place to start would be for you to maybe tell us a little bit about the origins of Sino-Indian animosity in this particular part of the Himalayas.
Sure, thanks. I mean, how long do you have on?
If you can do this in a few minutes, I know you lecture for a living, but a few minutes would be ideal.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I just make a couple of quick points about the origins. Right? It goes back really to the founding of both India and the People's Republic of China as independent sovereign nation states in the late 1940s, and how their relations evolved in the early 1950s. And by about mid to late 1950s, right, it was clear to leaders on both sides that they did not view the alignment of their border as being in the same place. And I won't go over sort of all of the history there, except to say that I think is when the border dispute crystallized. It involves, generally speaking, three sectors. In the east, about 90,000 square kilometers. It, back then was known as the Northeastern Frontier Agency, or NIFA. It is now the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Then you have the western sector, where we're seeing most of the activity today. That's about 33,000 square kilometers of land. I should add that the eastern sector has really since the 1950s been under Indian control, and the western sector, by that same token, has been more or less under Chinese control. And then you have the central sector, which is kind of west of Nepal and sort of east of the western sector, to confuse people further, and that's about roughly 2,000 square kilometers of land. And so basically you've had this dispute where control has been divided. India has a dominant position in one side, China has a dominant position in the other side, and due to sort of tensions that escalated in the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, the two countries fought a short but intense border war along the entire front of the disputed border. China attacked India first, moving across in two different phases, first in October and then in November. And from China's point of view, it was trying to sort of eliminate Indian pressure on the border that, from their perspective, had been mounting, especially in early 1962 under what is sometimes described as the forward policy under Nehru of the Indian occupation of territory, especially in the western sector of the dispute, where China, I think, has placed the most attention because of a road that connects Xinjiang with Tibet. Now, there have been periodic dust-ups afterwards. In 1967, there was a pretty intense artillery battle in a place that's along the sort of Sikkim border with China. And then in 1986-87, there was a very intense standoff in a place called Sundarungchu or Guangdong, which is in the eastern sector, and more or less in the same place where the war started back in October 1962. That led, those events in the late 80s really actually were the spark for normalization of ties between the two countries and to efforts to actually bring about some kind of agreement leading to the confidence building measures in the 1990s. But it's never been resolved. There is no agreed upon border between the two countries. There's something called the line of actual control, which has a very long kind of history and different usages at different points in time. It's sort of the de facto border today, but it basically just refers to a line that divides Chinese and Indian forces who still garrison and patrol these areas quite regularly and intensively in some cases. And so sort of what we're seeing today is basically an sort of renewed Chinese activism, especially in the western sector. There was also an incident adjacent to Sikkim, again at a place called Nak Ula, but the real sort of focus of activity has been in the western sector, primarily in the Galwan River Valley, Pangong Lake, and an area known as sort of the Hot Springs.
Right. Well, so that was a tremendous tour de force in, I believe that was around 4 minutes, which is quite impressive. But I think we covered most of the main terms, and I know for many listeners that's probably just going to be scratching the surface because there is a lot more depth to this, as Taylor indicated. So, what I've been trying to make sense of what's been happening recently. So one of the things that's quite notable, and I think you highlighted this well in your Washington Post piece, is what we're seeing right now is, in a way, not new, which is the idea that PLA, presumably PLA, are pricking India over the line of actual control. That much we've grown used to, even in the 2010s, even before Doklam. But what is new is the intensity and the variety of places in which this is happening at the same time. We have around 3, give or take, hotspots in the western sector, and then we had a standoff at Nak Ula in Sikkim. Is that a fair description that matches your assessment of the situation?
Yes, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and I think at the core of what we're learning is, and I was joking around with Sushant Singh, who's been one of the better Indian reporters on this beat for a few years now, frankly, that I think what we're learning is that the line of actual control is a very misleading term to many people, because you look at maps of this area and you see many of these maps will have a line of actual control, and that seems to indicate, a common understanding. But also, Nirupama Rao, an Indian, former senior Indian diplomat, actually the former Indian Foreign Secretary, had a very good thread on Twitter sort of helping people make sense of this. And, she pointed out that the line of actual control is misleading in many ways because this is not mutually defined, it hasn't been mutually delineated, and it has never been demarcated. Which means that what we're talking about, and when you read these Indian reports talking about Chinese troops on, quote, Indian territory, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry comes back and says we have Indian troops on Chinese territory, what you really begin to see is, I think, a very fuzzy area when it comes to talking about this line of control. Is that fair, Taylor, or do you think there's something more going on here?
No, it's totally fair. I mean, I almost think the line of actual control should just be called the line of separation. Right, because it's basically what separates Indian and Chinese forces. But it's clear, given that much of this territory is remote and desolate in some cases, the terrain is rough, that actual control is not exercised on either side all the time by either side, right? And I think why you get these different incidents at different points in time is because both China and India want to increase their presence along the disputed border, primarily through road building and also through patrolling. And that then leads to moments whereby it's not, or whereby questions are raised about where exactly this line of actual control lies and whether or not Indian forces have moved into what China views as its territory, or Chinese forces have moved into what India views as Indian territory. And of course, in many places, and I thought the number was only 13, but Sushant has an article yesterday putting it in the 20s. And there may be at least 20 areas, right, where each side views the location of the line of actual control or the line of separation differently.
Yeah, and I think one of the better demonstrations of this idea, I think, is Pangong Lake. It's this, again, listeners don't have a map in front of them, which I think is a shame with the podcast format. But imagine this snaking horizontal lake high up on the Ladakh Plateau, and this lake has what are known as fingers, effectively little outcrops of land, and at various times, Indian and Chinese patrols conduct patrols to overlapping parts, and this has been sort of accepted practice for a while. But obviously, as one might imagine, this does lead to times of tension when the two sides come very close to each other. And despite how tense the border has been, I think it's important to emphasize that there hasn't been a shot fired in decades. And
yeah, 1975.
1975. There we go. The last time,
or at least the last death in the border was 1975.
Right, but what we do see with Doklam is, there's the phrase that the Indians love to repeat, which is eyeball to eyeball standoffs along the disputed border. Although Doklam technically wasn't part of a disputed border, but I think the current situation, a part of the reason it's been quite concerning is that I think we saw scuffles and people getting down to fist fights and tossing rocks at multiple points along the border, all within a span of a few days. And I think that intensity, if I'm not mistaken, is somewhat unprecedented in recent times.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the previous moment would have been, I think, one kind of brawl around Pangong Lake back in 2017, but before that, relatively infrequent. And in this case, right, there are certainly reports of multiple brawls in some of these different locations, Nakula as well as Pangong Lake, and they seem to have occurred over, in some cases, a couple of days, or maybe they've occurred repeatedly. We don't actually have necessarily great information, because the information that we do have is, as far as I can tell, right, is essentially coming from sort of sources within either the Indian government or other parts, or the Indian military, and then being sort of reported in the Indian press. So I don't know if we have the full kind of picture of what's happening, but clearly kind of the shoving and all that stuff maybe is unprecedented in terms of scale today than what we've seen since the 1960s.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I do want to dig in a little bit about the sources of our information, because I think it's been quite interesting to, depending on the reports you read and depending on the specific reporter, whether they're talking to an Indian military source or an Indian diplomatic source, you hear very different things about what's happening at the border. And that's actually part of the reason that, I've been trying to wrap my head around all this before saying too much more, at least in writing. Because most of the military sources have been treating this on the Indian side as unprecedented, serious, tantamount to an invasion in some cases, whereas diplomatic sources and many senior political leaders in the BJP government in India have been really restrained in talking about this, basically. Depending on, again, who you read, implying that there have never been any Chinese troops at any point on what India considers to be its own territory, or that, there is something happening, but it's all being managed via diplomatic back channels. Right. It's just tremendously hard to make sense of. But on the Chinese side, I'm wondering, what are the sources to really make sense of really what is driving China here, or why China is doing what it's doing?
Well, there are basically no sources for a couple of reasons, right? One, China does not have a free media, so you can't have enterprising journalists like Sushant Singh, who, by the way, I think is absolutely an outstanding reporter in all respects. I think he's done so much to bring light as well as heat to our understanding. But you don't have that dynamic in China, right? So you can't, call up someone you might know in the PLA and ask them about the situation. More generally, in this dispute, and actually many of China's border disputes, China never reports on what it believes to be incursions by the opposing side. And in fact, I'm not really aware after 1962 of China ever providing kind of detailed reporting of what it might view as Indian transgressions of the Chinese line of actual control or the line of separation. And so we're basically left with what comes out of the Indian side. And then finally, you have a few sort of tantalizing tidbits in the Global Times, which I treat with great caution because although it is a party, although it is a newspaper linked with the People's Daily Publishing Group and thus a party paper, it doesn't necessarily speak authoritatively. And they've had a few sort of op-eds they've run by kind of Chinese scholars, which I think are probably an effort at signaling. But of course, these individuals don't really know what's going on the border either. And so it is really difficult if one wants to try to understand the tactical situation on the ground to be able to do so by going through Chinese sources, right? It just makes it. It's always been this way, right? This has always been very, very difficult. One minor exception was Doklam, and Doklam we got more information out of China, largely I think because China viewed Indian forces then as crossing across even what India recognized as an international frontier, although India believed it was going into Bhutanese territory and Chinese believed it was resident in Chinese territory. And so China published some maps and sort of more information that they normally do. But basically, it's an asymmetric information environment. This is not to say, right, that the reports coming out of India are systematically sort of biased. It's more to say that the information is incomplete. And oftentimes the Indian sources don't report on certain elements of Indian activity that you might want to know more about if you were trying to understand sort of Chinese responses.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the most fascinating comments actually from any Indian source was General Naravane, the chief of the Indian Army, who I believe early on in May actually talked about aggressive behavior on both sides, which I found kind
Yes.
of fascinating coming from an Indian Army chief.
And
Um,
and one account of Nakula, right, has a junior Indian officer punching a more senior Chinese officer in what appears to have been the first blow, at least of that particular account, right?
yeah.
And now this one is published because it's sort of glorifying the younger or the more junior ranked Indian officer standing up and protecting his senior officer in the face of kind of aggressive moves or posture by the Chinese. But the broader point here is that we don't know nearly as much, say, when compared with the South China Sea, where at least um, governments are more willing to speak out on all sides, and we have overhead satellite imagery that is pretty actually easy to interpret relative to what we might have on the China-India border. And so there's a little bit of a better sense of kind of what's happening. Finally, I would say, right, you can't trust, and no one should trust any line that appears on any digital map, right? I don't know where Google gets its boundaries data from, right? It's not clear if this is the line of actual control. These are the claim lines. Then, of course, Google shows different lines based upon which country it's in. And so, but nothing, I would say, on Google Maps or maybe any of these other sources should be taken as a definitive sort of rendering of what the line is or how it is seen by both sides.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, that's the one thing we haven't really discussed is that there has been a fair bit because we live in the era of highly persistent, high cadence satellite imagery. There have been, again, dueling analyses in this area with various people claiming various things. But again, while we can point to Indo-Tibetan Border Police infrastructure and PLA infrastructure in the area, because the fundamental question I think is this very fuzzy line of actual control, which is literally I think a very fuzzy line. I mean, it's almost a blurry sort of zone of, you know, I guess it was Vipin Narang on Twitter who said that it was a zone of perceptual ambiguity, which I thought was actually kind of nice. When you're talking about things like this, really the geospatial analysis even has limited value because you are talking about differences in political perceptions on the ground. But I think the final place to maybe go with our conversation today is to talk a little bit about why now. This has been something that's cropped up in a lot of Indian reports. With everybody has their pet theory. This is China making the most of the pandemic. This is China pushing back on the Indian press, celebrating Taiwan's response to the pandemic. This is China teaching India a lesson for cozying up to the United States, what have you. But I think you had a narrower analysis in your Washington Post piece focused on changes to the status quo on the Indian side of the line of control. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Sure. And let me bring in some thoughts I shared on a Twitter thread as well. They didn't quite make it into the Washington Post piece. But I think my broader view here is looking at kind of patterns of tensions on the border, right, going back to the 62 war. And one thing that I think is striking is major episodes and events seem to take place in the spring, right? Primarily because of the inhospitable nature of the environment. This is when the snow melts, activity resumes, and sort of mischief can be made on both sides. But certainly the spring of 1962 is when India rolled out the forward policy to challenge Chinese posts that had been put up over a longer period of time beforehand. But China was also doing much of this in the spring, or at least in the summer. The 86, 87 standoff at Sundrong or Guangdong, right, had to do with India and China competing over an area that was originally demilitarized after 1962 to create a seasonal outpost. And India had gone in and occupied this for several years, I believe, starting in 83. And then China decided that they didn't want that to become permanent. So they went in and occupied it in 86, and thus sort of set off the string of events. You had Chinese road building in Doklam, which was looking a little bit later in the spring, but early June. And so there is a seasonality here that I think is important because it links to the second point I would make, which is that certainly based upon everything I've read, and really primarily coming out of Indian sources, right? There's a great commitment on the Indian side to improving its position along the line of actual control. And where India has some natural strength that China lacks is in the Western sector. And so last year you had the completion of the DS-DBO road. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce the names of all of these places correctly, but it goes from the northern part of the Western sector where there's an airfield at a place called Dalit Bek Oldie, if I'm pronouncing that right, down to two villages known as Shayok and Darbuk. And this basically gives Indian forces lateral movement along much of the Western sector, although not all of it. And then there's a much broader effort now to build feeder roads and sort of a goal of completing this by 1962. Thirdly, and so there's just a lot, there seems to be much greater Indian activity, especially in the Western sector, right? Because it's much easier for India to access the line of actual control in the Western sector than it is for India to access it in the Eastern sector. And so, my sort of Occam's razor simplest explanation is that China has always been pretty sensitive to Indian efforts to improve its position, even though overall China enjoys a pretty strong position. And it is tended to respond what it views India as making gains that might shift or alter the situation along the line of actual control. And I think what we've seen most recently with the completion of the DS-DBO road, along with a lot of other things that have been happening within India on the border, that the Indian position has improved. Indian newspaper reports have talked about for several years now the way in which the Indian posture has improved along the line of actual control in terms of the frequency and scope of patrols that India has been able to undertake. I suspect that China has been observing this and that got their attention. Why now in the spring? It appears of 2020 that there appears to have been some additional construction of these feeder roads. And I also just wonder, I can't prove this, but I wonder if there's a sort of a hangover of Doklam where I think India really did catch China by surprise, both with where it moved into sort of undisputed either Bhutanese or Chinese territory, but not Indian territory, and the way in which they did that in 2017. And so I suspect China's response today may also be sort of influenced by sort of the sense on the part of those in the PLA watching the border that they need to be extra vigilant about Indian actions. And so if there is greater construction in some of these areas that might enhance India's position, it could quite likely be what would elicit sort of a Chinese response. Mm-hmm. Now, I admit that this is speculative, right? And we talked earlier about data sources; it's hard to come by, but it does seem to fit, like with sort of the pattern of crises that we've seen on the border since 1962. We didn't get a chance to talk about more recent ones in 2013 and 2014, but it's probably pretty similar.
Right. And so, just one last thing is potential off-ramps. So Doklam, I think, ended with a face-saving, quote, disengagement. And I think it's fair to say that if you ask a fair bit of the Indian commentariat on these issues, the perception is that India came away from Doklam preserving what it sought to preserve. But then if you go look at a satellite image of the piece of territory that was subject to that 72-day standoff before summer 2017 and afterwards, you see a very different picture. You see improved roads, tents, other infrastructure for China on that piece of territory. So it was a face-saving solution. The standoff ended, and they went into the summits between Xi and Modi to try and quote reset the relationship. Is that what we're going to see here with this this round of crisis? And I know the last thing a scholar wants to be asked is to predict the future, but it is something that I found myself wondering: is what are the possible off ramps here?
Yes, I mean, I think China, on the one hand, right, it has a dilemma in its relations with India. On the one hand, it doesn't want to appear weak in the border dispute, especially in light of what it probably appears as sort of persistent Indian efforts to improve its position. On the other hand, good ties with India actually serve a lot of Chinese strategic interests. And so that this makes me think that China is not trying to dramatically alter the status quo in the Western sector. Some of the areas in which they have moved in, I don't think are particularly defensible in the long term for China. So this looks and feels and smells to me like signaling. That would be point one. Point two would be, since the line of actual control is so fuzzy, I think there are probably greater opportunities for kind of some sort of face-saving de-escalation than there were in Doklam, because that area in some ways was pretty clearly delineated, not just because it was very narrowly defined in geographic scope, but also simply the geography in the area and the ridge lines pretty much indicated where the boundary was located. And so I think certainly China has an opportunity to move its forces back from some of the areas in which they've moved into. And again, it's a little hard to know exactly where these are, but I think they certainly have the opportunity to do that. And I think Indian statements, public statements, including from the defense minister recently, as well as some of the other ones that you mentioned at the outset, have also, I think, tried to preserve room for a face-saving solution. And we see the same thing on the Chinese side. And so all of this leads me to believe that neither the Indian political leadership, or the Chinese political leadership has so clearly tied its hands that they can't find a way to disengage. At the same time, right, this is not a small Chinese action, and it is much larger in scope and scale than what happened in 2013 or 2014, and for that reason, I think it's going to perhaps take a longer period of time.
Taylor, we're unfortunately out of time, but I did want to thank you for coming on and sharing your insights on this subject. I learned a lot from you, so thanks for joining me today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.